Hello everyone!
Hello, welcome to My Data News, and we are here for the news about February 2022.
Yes, and you can already see the agenda on your screen about today. We have some great topics. So let's start now with some life science news. So, major overhaul of EU clinical trial rules kicks in on 21 January 2022. And with the CTR finally becoming applicable, the harmonization of clinical trials rules across EU EEA countries will hopefully inspire the European Data Protection Board, so the EDPB, to issue consistent guidance on critical topics such as controller-processor qualification on sponsors and sites, the legal basis for processing of clinical trial data, and the use also of clinical trial data for secondary purposes.
Another news about the life sciences, it's like the senators into bipartisan effort toward modernizing health privacy laws. So 2 weeks ago, the senators Tammy Baldwin and Bill Cassidy introduced the Health Data Use and Privacy Commission Act, aimed at starting the process of modernizing health data use and privacy policies. The legislation, supported by several industry representatives, including Athena Health, Epic, IBM, and Teladoc Health, would establish a commission tasked with providing recommendations to Congress about updates to health information privacy laws. We will continue with the second part of this news. So we are going to the data protection section. The first news is breaking news for the new EU UK SECs. The Secretary of State laid before Parliament on the 28th January the International Data Transfer Agreement, the famous IDTA, and the International Data Transfer Addendum to the European Commission standard contractual clauses for international transfer, that we currently call SCCs. The document, which replaced the current standard contractual clauses in the UK, will enter into force on the 21st of March if the Parliament doesn't request any changes. The ICO said that the IDTA and addendum are written with the aim of helping organizations ensure they have the correct protections in place when transferring people data outside of the EU, UK to a country not covered by adequacy decision. Applying high standards of data protection to global data flows is essential in maintaining people's trust in this ecosystem.
UK-US data protection claim highlights ambiguity of GDPR's geographic scope. So, decision by the UK Court of Appeal to allow a claim for contravention of the European Union's GDPR to be served against US defendants has raised questions over the territorial limits of the regulation. And the case emphasizes the broad geographic applicability of both the EU GDPR and the UK GDPR and the interpretation that exists. And the UK Court of Appeal suggested that the UK's Independent Information Rights Authority, named ICO, should assist in the case.
The EDPB has adopted its first opinion on certification criteria. The EDPB adopted its opinion on the GDPR and the CARPA certification scheme submitted to the board by the Luxembourg Supervisory Authority. This is the first time that the EDPB adopts a consistency opinion on criteria for a national-wide certification scheme. The GDPR and the CARPA certification is a general scheme which does not focus on a specific sector or type of processing. It includes requirements on data protection governance in the organization surrounding the processing activity. As a reminder, controller and processor adhering to our certification mechanism also gain greater visibility and credibility, as it allows individuals to quickly assess the level of protection of the processing operations. The EDPB opinion aims to ensure the consistency and correct application of certification criteria among SAs in the European Economic Area. To this end, the EDPB considers that a number of changes need to be made to the draft certification criteria.
Big news from Google. So we already know that Google plans to block third-party cookies set by default on the Chrome browser, sometimes in 2023. And in place of the third-party cookies at Model, Google's Privacy Sandbox project had proposed alternatives, and most notably FLoC. So they recently announced that they will scrap FLoC, and instead Google will test Topics API, so Chrome-based advertising platform. And the Chrome browser will monitor users' browsing activities and select relevant interests where relevant ads will be served. And this is supposed to be more privacy forward, since behavioral data and decisions will remain inside the browser on the user's device and not at Google.
I continue with Google. The state attorneys general sue Google with dark portal claims. The attorneys general from Indiana, Texas, and Washington states were staging a coordinated effort to address Google's alleged work on deceiving and manipulating consumers to gain access to their location data. An American attorney, Carl Racine, said that Google falsely led consumers to believe that changing their account and device setting would allow customers to protect their privacy and control what personal data the company could access.
Europe pitches tech principles to rule the internet. So at the beginning of the month, the European Commission presented its so-called Digital Decade principles aimed at defining the 27 country blocs' vision on how the digital economy should abide by values such as democracy, privacy, solidarity, freedom of choice, and security. And it's Europe attempts at turning its approach to internet governance into the global standard. And Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton said the EU's digital constitutional basis would help promote democratic digital principles on the global stage. And besides this, the US is expected also to launch its so-called Alliance for the Future of the Internet next month, and which will gather democratic countries around a common vision for a free web. And authoritarian regimes like China and Russia have pushed their own approaches to the internet, which include heavy government control over online content and limits on how data can leave their jurisdictions.
I'm coming back to the ADPB and the guideline number 5. So, MyData-TRUST are response to the public consultation, and you can find our response on our website. We welcome the important clarification brought by the guideline number 5 2021 on the interplay between the application of the Article 3 of the GDPR and the provision on international transfer. So, however, MyData-TRUST believes that the guidelines are a missing opportunity to clarify several aspects of the subject and provide additional means to achieve compliance with the GDPR. Moreover, the example described, although very interesting, appear oversimplified compared to the real-life scenarios and don't help to understand how to comply in the absence of a long-awaited tools, while the European Data Protection Board itself points to this gap. The urgent need to clearly allow the use of the new SECs in case of transfer of to an entity under the scope of the GDPR as per the Article 3.2 until the additional later set is available. This missing opportunity to provide clear guidelines on what transfer tools and group-level specific measures could be implemented to have in place a solid GDPR compliance program to frame intra-group data disclosure. We really need to further illustrate and clarify the notion of direct data flow, the collection of data from individuals not qualifying as transfer. To urgently address the inconsistencies in the approaches between the ADPB and the European Commission, and to provide a clear consensus to the stakeholders.
The Belgian DPA imposed a 250k fine on IAB Europe. So the DPA has found that the Transparency and Consent Framework, TCF, developed by IAB Europe, fails to comply with a number of provisions of the GDPR. And the DCF is a widespread mechanism that facilitates the management of users' preferences for online personalized advertising and that plays a pivotal role in the so-called real-time bidding. And the Belgian DPA gives IAB Europe 2 months to present an action plan to bring its activities into compliance.
After the knowledge about the cookies, new online tracking methods. So what's the solution to protect yourself? Cookies are not the only way to track your online activity. Web actors are increasingly resorting to alternatives such as unique digital fingerprinting or tracking your IP address, especially to offer targeted advertising.
Google Analytics in the crosshairs of the CNIL. So the CNIL has recently received several complaints from NOIP regarding the use of Google Analytics. And the CNIL has launched a public notice and procedures are underway actually for a call to vigilance regarding the conditions under which the data collected are transferred to the United States. And if Google has adopted additional measures to control the transfer of data within the framework of Google Analytics functionality, these are considered as not sufficient to exclude the possibility of access to this data by the US surveillance intelligence services, and the use of Google Analytics is now considered as unacceptable. So CNIL proposed a list of solutions as alternative to the use of Google Analytics, and if you use Google Analytics, it is time to reconsider it and to change it with some other valid solutions.
Mark Zuckerberg and team consider shutting down Facebook and Instagram in Europe if Meta cannot process European data on US servers. So if Meta is not given the option to transfer, store and process data from its European user on US-based server, Facebook and Instagram may be shut down across Europe. The social media giant's owner reportedly warned in its annual report. The key issue for Meta is transatlantic data transfer regulated via the so-called Privacy Shield and other model agreements that Meta used to store data from European users on American server. The current agreements to enable data transfer are currently under heavy scrutiny in the EU.
US-EU data transfers on live support after French Google decision. So Europe is finally starting to walk the talk on US data transfers. And over a year after the EU top court annulled the Privacy Shield, an EU-US data flow deal, in the so-called Schrems II decision, negotiators in Brussels and Washington have yet to strike a replacement agreement. So the struggle is that bringing an impasse over what it means to give Europeans the ability to legally challenge US surveillance practices. And now that landmark decision, which upheld other data transfer instruments but increased requirements to keep the data safe, is starting to bite. And as privacy regulators across the bloc actually begin to enforce the decision's onerous provisions. That's prompting companies like Google, Microsoft, and TikTok to consider once unthinkable storing even more data in Europe.
EU DPA start coordinated enforcement action on cloud in the public sector. The EDPB has recently launched its first coordinated enforcement action on the use of cloud-based services by the public sector. The DPAs are concerned about data transfer in light of the Schrems II ruling that invalidated the EU-US Privacy Shield. The aim of this initiative is to enhance compliance with the GDPR through coordinated guidance and action, and foster best practice. The DPAs will send questionnaires to 75 public bodies across EEA countries to identify if a formal investigation is warranted. Any enforcement actions will be decided at the national level. 2 codes of conduct have been adopted at the EU level: the EU Cloud Code of Conduct and the Cloud Infrastructure Service Provider Europe. The EDPB will publish its finding on this exercise before the end of this year, before the end of 2022.
EDPB announced launch of first coordinated enforcement action on use of cloud by public sector. So last week, the European Data Protection Board, EDPB, announced that it had launched its first coordinated enforcement action. In particular, the EDPB stated that in the coming months, 22 national supervisory authorities across the European Economic Area, including the European Data Protection Supervisor, EDPS, will launch investigation into the use of cloud-based services by the public sector.
We come back to Meta and Facebook. A decision on Facebook transatlantic data transfer is expected by April. The Irish Data Protection Commission gave Meta a 28-day deadline today to respond to a revised decision. Then it will go to the other EU regulator to come for comment and objections.
Data protection and management of health data in Spain. So there is a Q&A guide to data protection and management for digital health in Spain, covering anonymized health data, enforcement, cybersecurity, and more. So the European Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, provides the definition of health data, and particularly under section 4.15, the GDPR defines health data as personal data related to the physical or mental health of a natural person, including the provision of healthcare services, which reveal information about his or her health status. And the Spanish Data Protection Act reaffirms this definition, and the Spanish Data Protection Authority includes genetic data as health data, which refer to personal data relating to the inherited or acquired genetic characteristics of an individual that provide unique information about that person's physiology or health, and that is obtained in particular from the analysis of a biological sample of that person.
We'll continue with the last part of this MyData-NEWS. So we go to the legislation. Whistleblowing topic. What is the impact of the EU directive, for example, in Belgium? On the 23 October 2019, the EU legislature adopted the whistleblowing directive with the aim to afford a specific protection to persons who report breaches of EU law that are harmful to the public interest. According to the EU legislature, whistleblowers play a key role in exposing and preventing breaches of EU laws in safeguarding the welfare of society. This directive seeks to introduce effective, confidential, and secure reporting channels and to ensure that whistleblowers are effectively protected against retaliation. By the 17 December 2021, Member States should have adopted measures to comply with this directive. But by the same deadline, private companies with more than 2050 employees should have established their internal channels and procedure in compliance with the directive and the applicable national law. And by the 17 December 2023, so 2 years after, private companies with 15 to 2049 workers should establish their internal channel to enable whistleblowing.
In Israel, beginning of February 2022, this month, the draft bill for Privacy Protection Law 2022 had been submitted to the Parliament. So in addition to the new Privacy Protection Bill amending the protection of privacy law, a private proposed bill for amending the PPL was submitted by the chairman of the Statutes Committee in the Parliament. And that is a much more comprehensive bill based on a project by the Israeli Institute for Democracy, attempting to cause the deliberation on Amendment 14 to be conducted together with this proposal so that the bill that is finally proposed for vote in Parliament will be more comprehensive.
In Canada, the Quebec's Commission d'accès à l'information outlined obligations coming into force in September under amendment to the Act respecting the protection of personal information in the private sector. The Commission said companies must designate an individual responsible for protecting personal information, report incidents posing a risk of serious harm, and notify the Commission before implementing biometric technique. The Commission said other obligations will take effect over the next 3 years.
In Brazil, Congress enacts constitutional amendment for protection of personal data as fundamental right. So the president of the National Congress, Senator Rodrigo Pacheco, promulgated on 10 February 2022 the constitutional amendment number 115 of 2022, which includes the protection of personal data as a fundamental right and guarantee it in the Brazilian constitution. So, this amendment grants the Union exclusive competence to legislate, organize, and supervise the protection and processing of personal data through the creation of Article 5 in the Brazilian Constitution.
In Belgium, the director of the Data Protection Authority resigned in protest over a lack of independence. 2 weeks ago, Frank Robert resigned from his position in response to EU concern about possible conflict of interest. As explained a month ago, some members of the board had conflict of interest. This problem had even been noted before by the European Commission and almost cost Belgium a fine for non-compliance with the GDPR.
In Israel, Privacy Protection Authority draft opinion regarding onward data transfer has been released. So, beginning of January 2022, Israeli Privacy Protection Authority issued a draft opinion for public consultation and proposing its interpretation of the requirements under Regulation 3 of the Privacy Protection and regarding onward data transfers. So the PPA's interpretation reflects the practice that was established over the years in order to qualify the use of subprocessors and to validate the processing of personal information by them. However, in practice, it may be difficult to obtain a controller's written consent for such transfer, especially since usually the list of subprocessors engaged by global providers is subject to frequent changes, and subprocessors themselves engage subprocessors of their own.
In Oman, the Sultanate issues new data protection law. The Ministry of Information announced on the 9th February 2022 that Royal Decree No. 6 of 2022 promulgating the law on the protection of personal data, the Data Protection Law, had been issued by the HRH, the Sultan Atman, and published in the official gazette, the number 1429 on the 13th February 2022. In particular, the Data Protection Law consists of 32 articles, which, among other things, introduce data protection principles that brings the country's legislative regime into closer alignment with the global data protection law.
And there is a CPRA update. The California Privacy Protection Agency announced rulemaking timeline. So the California Privacy Protection Agency said its new California Privacy Rights Act rules will not be final until the third or fourth quarter. So this leaves a little time for businesses to subject to the CPRA to be in compliance by January 1, 2023.
Thank you to follow us. It's already the second video of this year, but at the end of the year 2021, we publish a book, My Data Book, and if you want to have access, do not hesitate to register to our newsletter and to follow us on our social media.
Yes, thank you, and see you next month for more news.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.